The morning Duke Richard Ashcroft praised a loaf of bread, the entire castle forgot to breathe. Breakfast in Ashcroft Castle was usually a silent ritual of polished silver, measured conversation, and expensive dishes that tasted ordinary despite their cost. Yet that autumn morning, one bite changed everything. Richard broke the crust with his knife, watched steam curl into the air, and tasted bread unlike any he had ever known. The crust crackled perfectly, the center remained soft as a cloud, and the flavor carried warmth that reminded him of home before duty had hardened every corner of his life. He slowly lowered the slice onto his plate and looked toward the nervous servants waiting along the wall. "Who baked this?" he asked quietly. The head cook stepped forward with a proud smile already forming. "I did, Your Grace." Before Richard could respond, an elderly kitchen maid trembled where she stood. Years of service had bent her back, but not her conscience. Barely louder than a whisper, she said, "Forgive me, Your Grace, it wasn't the chef. It was the new girl." Richard rose from his chair without another word. Every servant hurried after him through the stone corridors until they reached the enormous kitchens, where dozens of cooks, bakers, and maids scattered in panic. Near the largest mixing table, a young woman knelt on the cold floor, gathering ruined dough into a bucket. Flour dust covered her brown hair and plain dress. A red mark glowed across one cheek where someone had clearly shoved her only moments earlier. No one offered to help her. "So," Richard said, folding his arms, "this is the remarkable baker?" Several servants exchanged amused glances. The head cook shrugged dramatically. "She barely arrived yesterday, Your Grace." Richard looked Eleanor Whitmore up and down. She appeared too young, too quiet, and far too ordinary to deserve the praise a single loaf had inspired. His voice carried easily across the kitchen. "She won't last a day here." Laughter rippled through the room. Some servants smirked while others quickly looked away, embarrassed to join in yet afraid not to. Eleanor slowly stood, brushed flour from her hands, and met the Duke's eyes without defiance or fear. "Perhaps not," she answered softly. "But everyone deserves one honest day's work." Silence spread faster than laughter ever had. Richard frowned. He had expected excuses or tears, not calm dignity. Without another comment, he turned and left the kitchens, convinced she would disappear before sunset like so many new servants before her. Eleanor watched him go before returning quietly to her work. By afternoon she had learned why the castle felt uneasy despite its beauty. Towering walls surrounded elegant gardens, glittering chandeliers illuminated grand halls, and priceless portraits watched from every corridor. Visitors admired perfection. Those who lived there saw something different. Pantry shelves emptied too quickly. Meat vanished before reaching the kitchens. Wine barrels mysteriously leaked. Servants whispered instead of speaking openly. Fear traveled through the castle faster than kindness. Months earlier the old steward had died after falling from the western tower. Officially it had been an accident. Unofficially almost no servant believed that story. Since his death, confusion had spread through every department. Bills arrived unpaid, supplies disappeared, and no one accepted responsibility. Richard spent most of his days managing lands beyond the castle walls, believing loyal staff still kept everything under control. He never noticed the cracks widening beneath his own roof. Eleanor noticed them within hours. She counted sacks of flour before storing them and realized 6 were missing from the inventory. She found fresh vegetables rotting because no one rotated storage. Entire baskets of yesterday's bread lay discarded while stable boys quietly rubbed empty stomachs. No one seemed shocked. Waste had become habit. That evening Eleanor carried her single blanket to the servants' attic, where rain dripped steadily through broken roof tiles. Before she could settle, someone stole the blanket while she fetched water. Her shoes vanished before dawn. At breakfast, boiling soup splashed across her hands after another maid deliberately bumped her elbow. The head cook later ordered her finest loaf burned for being too dark, though everyone had seen it emerge perfectly golden from the oven. She accepted every cruelty without complaint, answering each insult with quiet determination instead of anger. Long after midnight, when most of the castle slept, Eleanor mixed one final batch of dough using scraps that would otherwise have been thrown away. She baked several small loaves, wrapped them in cloth, and quietly left them outside the stable, where hungry children would discover them before sunrise. As she returned inside, thunder rolled across the dark sky, and the first fierce winds of an approaching storm shook the ancient castle, carrying with them the promise that before winter truly arrived, everything inside these walls was about to change. By dawn the storm had become a prison. The stone bridge connecting Ashcroft Castle to the nearest village had collapsed into the swollen river, leaving broken arches beneath churning water. Wagons carrying flour, firewood, and medicine turned back, while frightened messengers admitted no repairs could begin until the weather calmed. Every person inside the estate understood the same harsh truth. Whatever food remained would have to last through the uncertain weeks ahead. Panic spread more quickly than hunger. Servants slipped extra portions beneath their aprons. The head cook locked cupboards and accused everyone of theft. Stable hands argued with gardeners over sacks of grain meant for horses. Even respectable workers began hiding potatoes beneath loose floorboards, fearing tomorrow more than shame. The castle, already weakened by mistrust, threatened to collapse into selfishness. Eleanor refused to join the panic. She borrowed a ledger no one had opened in months and spent the afternoon counting every barrel, basket, and sack in the storerooms. She measured flour, salt, oats, dried peas, smoked meat, and preserved apples until her fingers were coated with dust. The records exposed shocking waste. Enough food remained to feed everyone if managed wisely, yet careless habits would empty the shelves long before winter ended. Without waiting for permission, she quietly reorganized the kitchens. Fresh vegetables were moved before spoiled ones. Bread was sliced according to need instead of rank. Bones once discarded became nourishing broth. Small teams prepared meals in orderly shifts rather than competing for ovens. She even marked shelves with neat handwritten labels so nothing would be forgotten. Some servants laughed at her efforts, but within days the kitchens grew calmer, and the daily waste nearly disappeared. The head cook watched every improvement with growing resentment. Praise from other servants had begun drifting toward the quiet newcomer instead of the man who had ruled the kitchens for years. Jealousy hardened into malice. One evening several expensive silver serving spoons vanished from the dining hall, and before sunrise he loudly accused Eleanor of stealing them. The charge spread through the castle before breakfast. Richard arrived with the butler and ordered Eleanor's tiny attic room searched. She stood silently while every drawer, blanket, and wooden box was emptied onto the floor. Nothing resembling stolen silver appeared. Instead the servants uncovered neatly wrapped loaves, each bearing a carefully written name. Martha. Samuel. Little Thomas. Widow Grace. Every loaf had been intended for someone hungry. No one spoke. Richard picked up one bundle and unfolded the cloth. The bread was still warm. "Why hide these?" he asked quietly. "So no child has to beg for supper," Eleanor answered. The Duke looked around the room. There was no luxury, no comfort, and certainly no treasure. Only worn clothing, a family Bible, and enough hidden bread to feed those everyone else overlooked. He left without another accusation, carrying an unfamiliar weight of shame. That evening the first snowflakes drifted across the courtyard far earlier than expected. An elderly gardener named Mr. Ellis collapsed while hauling frozen firewood toward the kitchens. Servants hurried past, afraid the work would fall upon them if they stopped. Eleanor dropped her basket and rushed to him. Though smaller than the old man, she struggled to lift him onto her shoulders and dragged him toward the entrance through the deepening snow. Richard happened to step outside as she stumbled against the icy steps. Without hesitation he caught the unconscious gardener's other arm, and together they carried him into the warmth beside the great hearth. The castle physician declared that another few minutes in the cold might have cost the old man his life. When Ellis awoke, he weakly thanked Eleanor before recognizing Richard. "I served your mother," he whispered. "She never walked past suffering." Richard lowered his eyes, unable to answer. Later that night, Eleanor returned several account books to the steward's abandoned office after borrowing them for inventory. As she replaced the dusty ledgers, one column of figures caught her attention. Large payments had been approved for deliveries that never appeared in the storerooms. The signatures looked authentic, yet the supplies simply did not exist. Someone had been draining the estate for months, perhaps years. She closed the book carefully, realizing the missing flour, empty shelves, and frightened servants were only symptoms of a much larger betrayal. Near midnight, Richard wandered into the small chapel seeking silence. Candlelight flickered before the altar. Eleanor knelt alone, lighting one tiny flame after another. There were no family portraits, no flowers, no written names. "For whom are you praying?" he asked gently. She smiled without turning. "For people no one remembers anymore." Richard remained beside the doorway, listening to the quiet crackle of candle wicks. When Eleanor finally rose to leave, she noticed the draft creeping beneath the chapel door and wrapped her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. The next morning, Richard ordered that she be moved into warmer quarters. Eleanor thanked him, then declined. "If there are enough blankets for every servant," she said, "I'll gladly accept one too." Richard watched her walk away, realizing the woman he had dismissed on her first day possessed a strength no title could ever bestow. Winter settled over Ashcroft Castle with relentless determination. Snow buried the gardens, icy winds rattled ancient windows, and every sunrise brought another challenge for the people trapped behind the towering stone walls. Yet despite the bitter weather, the castle itself began changing in unexpected ways. Order slowly replaced confusion, arguments became less frequent, and meals reached every servant on time. Few realized that almost every improvement traced back to Eleanor Whitmore, who worked quietly from dawn until long after midnight without asking for recognition. The burden on the household grew heavier when Mrs. Harcourt, the elderly housekeeper who had faithfully managed the estate for decades, collapsed from exhaustion and fever. The physician ordered complete rest, warning that another day of work might end her life. Suddenly the castle stood without anyone capable of coordinating hundreds of servants, organizing supplies, or preparing for the long months of winter still ahead. Senior staff gathered in the servants' hall expecting disagreement over who should assume responsibility. Instead, one voice after another spoke the same name. Eleanor. The laundress suggested her first. The stable master agreed. The head gardener nodded. Even several kitchen maids who had once mocked her quietly supported the decision. Richard listened in astonishment. Only weeks earlier these same people had laughed when he predicted she would not survive her first day. Now they trusted her more than anyone else inside the estate. Reluctantly, he appointed Eleanor acting steward until Mrs. Harcourt recovered. She accepted only after making one request. "I don't want authority," she said. "I only want everyone to work together." From that morning forward, the rhythm of the castle transformed. Eleanor inspected every department before breakfast, checking kitchens, laundries, storerooms, servant quarters, stables, and gardens buried beneath snow. She repaired broken schedules instead of blaming people. She reassigned exhausted workers before they collapsed. She arranged warm soup for those laboring outdoors and insisted every servant receive time to rest. She memorized names with remarkable ease, greeting stable boys, scullery maids, gardeners, and guards as though each mattered equally. Before long the servants stopped calling her Miss Whitmore. Without discussing it among themselves, they began saying something different. Our Lady Eleanor. Not because she held noble blood. Because she carried herself with quiet nobility. Richard noticed the change every day. At first he observed from a distance, unwilling to interfere. Eventually curiosity overcame pride. He began joining Eleanor during her morning inspections, expecting to advise her but discovering instead that he had much to learn. She explained why kitchens function better when every worker understood the entire process instead of only one task. She showed him how careful planning prevented waste more effectively than harsh punishment. She greeted frightened children by kneeling to meet their eyes rather than speaking down to them. Their conversations gradually drifted beyond work. Richard admitted he had inherited the duchy unexpectedly after losing his father, leaving him constantly afraid of disappointing generations before him. Eleanor confessed she remembered almost nothing of her parents except the comforting smell of fresh bread and the belief that kindness cost nothing. They laughed together when flour covered Richard's expensive boots during a baking lesson. They teased each other over his inability to knead dough without making a mess. For the first time in years, the Duke found himself looking forward to each new morning. Not everyone welcomed the castle's renewal. The estate manager, Edmund Blackwell, watched Eleanor's growing influence with concealed fury. For years he had quietly stolen money by inventing deliveries, falsifying accounts, and pocketing the difference. Eleanor's careful inventories threatened everything he had built through deception. Realizing she would eventually uncover undeniable proof, he resolved to silence her before that happened. One freezing evening, smoke suddenly poured from the castle bakery. Flames raced across wooden beams with terrifying speed. Panic erupted as terrified servants shouted that several orphan children, helping prepare bread for the next day, remained trapped inside. Without hesitation, Eleanor ran toward the fire. Richard shouted for her to stop. She never slowed. He followed immediately. Inside, thick smoke swallowed every doorway. Burning shelves crashed around them while frightened children cried from the rear storeroom. Eleanor wrapped wet cloth around the smallest child's face and guided the others toward safety. A blazing beam crashed from the ceiling. Richard threw himself between the flames and Eleanor, taking the impact across his shoulder while pushing her clear. Moments later, the staircase beneath him collapsed. Eleanor grabbed his arm with both hands, refusing to release him despite the unbearable heat until together they reached the doorway carrying the last frightened child. Outside, snow hissed against burning timbers as servants rushed forward. Richard instinctively pulled Eleanor into a fierce embrace, forgetting rank, custom, and every watching eye. She trembled from exhaustion rather than fear, her soot-covered hands still searching the children to ensure none remained inside. Only after counting every frightened face did she finally lose consciousness. As the physician examined her, Richard remained beside the bed throughout the night. Hours later, Eleanor stirred briefly, barely opening her eyes. In a voice scarcely louder than a breath, she whispered, "Please, don't let the little ones be hungry." She slipped back into unconsciousness, and Richard realized with painful clarity that even standing between life and death, Eleanor's first thought had never been herself. Eleanor remained in bed for only 2 days before insisting she was strong enough to return to work. The physician protested, Mrs. Harcourt scolded her, and Richard firmly ordered her to rest. Eleanor thanked them all, then quietly rose before sunrise and resumed inspecting the kitchens with one arm wrapped in fresh bandages. Her determination spread through the castle faster than any command. Servants who had once complained about long hours now worked willingly, inspired by the woman who never asked anyone to endure what she would not endure herself. The fire had destroyed much of the bakery, forcing every meal to be prepared in smaller ovens scattered throughout the estate. Eleanor reorganized the entire operation before breakfast. Empty storage rooms became temporary kitchens, the blacksmith fashioned new baking trays from spare iron, and gardeners converted unused glasshouses into sheltered spaces for preserving vegetables. Every obstacle became another problem to solve rather than another excuse to surrender. Then winter revealed its cruelest face. A blizzard unlike any living servant remembered descended upon the valley. Snow buried doors halfway to their hinges, winds howled through the towers day and night, and temperatures fell so sharply that water froze inside pitchers beside the hearth. Travel became impossible, hunting ceased entirely, and even gathering firewood beyond the walls threatened death. The castle stood alone against the storm. Fear returned almost immediately. Parents worried their children would starve before spring. Elderly servants shivered despite every blanket available. Several workers developed dangerous fevers, while others secretly rationed food for themselves, believing shortages would soon become desperate. Eleanor gathered every department head inside the great hall. Instead of delivering a speech, she handed each person a simple list. The kitchens would prepare nourishing soup twice daily. The strongest workers would collect fallen timber whenever the wind weakened. Healthy servants would rotate through the infirmary to care for the sick. No room would keep two fires burning while another remained cold. Children, the elderly, and the ill would always eat first. No one argued. They simply began carrying out her plan. Richard watched the meeting from the back of the hall, amazed that Eleanor never raised her voice, yet everyone obeyed her willingly. She ruled through trust instead of fear, and the difference transformed the entire castle. Determined not to remain a spectator, Richard abandoned many privileges he had long accepted without thought. He carried firewood alongside stable hands until his gloves wore through. He delivered soup to feverish servants confined to their rooms. He shoveled snow from blocked entrances beside gardeners half his age. At first the workers stared in disbelief, but Eleanor merely smiled and handed him another task whenever he finished the last one. Late one afternoon a terrified stable boy burst into the hall. The east stable has fallen. Heavy snow had collapsed part of the roof, trapping several workers and horses beneath shattered beams. Richard immediately ordered everyone to wait until the storm eased. "The roof may fall again," he warned. Eleanor looked toward the buried stable where frightened voices echoed beneath the wind. "If we wait," she replied calmly, "they won't survive." Without another word she tied a rope around her waist and walked into the blizzard. Richard followed before anyone could stop him. The snow reached their knees, while fierce winds stole every breath. Together they crawled beneath the broken roof through a narrow opening barely wide enough for one person. Inside, darkness swallowed everything except the frightened eyes of trapped workers pinned beneath timber. Eleanor directed each rescue with remarkable composure, instructing Richard where to lift beams, when to cut tangled harnesses, and how to calm panicked horses. One by one they freed every injured servant before retreating moments ahead of another violent collapse. When they finally emerged, the courtyard erupted in relieved cheers. The rescued workers embraced their families, while several servants quietly removed their own coats to wrap around Eleanor and Richard. Neither noticed the gesture until warmth settled across their shoulders. Days later the blizzard weakened, but another challenge emerged. Edmund Blackwell attempted to flee the castle before the roads reopened completely. Guards discovered him loading heavy trunks onto a wagon hidden inside an abandoned barn. Richard ordered the luggage opened. Inside lay silver coins, forged account books, and documents proving years of theft from the estate. Blackwell denied everything, accusing Eleanor of fabricating evidence to seize authority. Richard listened without interruption before answering calmly. "You stole from hungry people to enrich yourself." The guilty man lowered his eyes. Angry servants demanded immediate execution, insisting justice required a public example. Richard turned toward Eleanor. "What would you do?" She regarded Blackwell quietly before speaking. "If cruelty ends with another act of cruelty, nothing truly changes. Let him answer for his crimes before the law. Let honesty prove stronger than revenge." Her words settled over the gathering like fresh snow. Richard ordered Blackwell imprisoned until the roads reopened, ending years of corruption without spilling another drop of blood. That evening silence filled the castle chapel as snow drifted gently beyond stained glass windows. Richard found Eleanor lighting the final candle before leaving. "I spent my life believing strength belonged to those who commanded others," he admitted. She looked at him with quiet curiosity. He stepped closer. "Then I met you." The candlelight reflected in his eyes. "You showed me that real strength belongs to those who choose kindness when cruelty would be easier." For a long moment neither spoke. Richard reached for her hand. She did not pull away. Their first kiss was gentle, unhurried, and honest, carrying no promise beyond the simple truth that neither wished to face another winter without the other beside them. Outside, dawn's first light touched the snow-covered towers, and for the first time since the storm began, Ashcroft Castle no longer felt like a place merely surviving the season, but a home learning how to hope again. Spring arrived slowly, melting the snow that had imprisoned Ashcroft Castle for months and revealing green fields where hope had nearly vanished. Streams rushed beneath the rebuilt bridge, birds returned to the gardens, and sunlight finally reached windows that had reflected only ice throughout the long winter. The estate looked unchanged from a distance, yet everyone living within its walls understood they no longer belonged to the same castle. Fear had surrendered to trust, waste had yielded to careful stewardship, and strangers had become a family held together by shared hardship and quiet courage. News of the remarkable transformation spread beyond the duchy until royal inspectors arrived to examine the estate themselves. They expected to find exaggerated stories invented by grateful servants. Instead, they discovered immaculate account books, overflowing grain stores, orderly kitchens, healthy workers, and children laughing freely in courtyards once filled with anxious whispers. Every department operated with surprising efficiency, while expenses had fallen despite improved living conditions. The inspectors privately admitted they had never visited a noble household managed with such fairness or discipline. Richard accepted their praise graciously but refused to claim achievements that were not his own. Whenever someone complimented the prosperity of Ashcroft Castle, he simply replied, "You should thank the woman who taught us how to care for one another." Eleanor blushed whenever she overheard those words, insisting she had merely done what anyone ought to do. The servants smiled because they knew better. She had changed not only the castle but the hearts of everyone inside it. While organizing the late steward's abandoned office before appointing a permanent replacement, Eleanor discovered a small locked chest hidden behind dusty shelves. Richard ordered it opened in the presence of Mrs. Harcourt and the royal inspectors. Inside rested several official documents clearing the estate's finances after Blackwell's arrest, along with a sealed letter bearing the elegant handwriting of Richard's late mother. The Duke unfolded the fragile paper carefully, his expression softening as he recognized the familiar script. The letter described a journey she had taken 24 years earlier through a nearby village after heavy rains delayed her carriage. Seeking shelter, she had entered a humble bakery where she witnessed an orphan little girl divide her only loaf between herself and another hungry child. Moved by such generosity, the Duchess secretly paid the baker to raise the girl with dignity and promised to support her future whenever possible without revealing her identity. Near the end she had written, "If kindness continues guiding that little soul, she will one day save more lives than wealth or titles ever could." Eleanor stood speechless. She remembered the elderly baker who had raised her with patience, honesty, and love. She had never known who quietly ensured flour always reached their shop during difficult seasons. Richard folded the letter with trembling hands. "My mother believed in you before either of us knew your name," he whispered. Eleanor smiled through grateful tears. "Then I hope I honored her faith." Days later the entire household gathered inside the great hall. Servants stood beside craftsmen, gardeners beside cooks, and children squeezed eagerly between adults who had become their protectors. Richard walked to the center of the room carrying the first wooden breadboard Eleanor had used on her arrival. He looked toward the crowded hall before speaking. "The first morning Eleanor entered this castle," he began, "I judged her before learning anything about her." Silence settled over every face. "I said she would not last a day." He paused, meeting Eleanor's eyes. "I have never spoken words more foolish than those." Gentle laughter echoed through the hall. "This castle still stands because she stayed. She fed the hungry, comforted the frightened, uncovered corruption, forgave where others demanded vengeance, and reminded its duke that leadership begins with service." One by one the servants bowed their heads toward Eleanor. Not because custom required it. Because gratitude did. Later that afternoon Richard invited Eleanor into the rebuilt bakery where sunlight warmed polished wooden tables and the comforting aroma of fresh bread filled the air. Resting between them lay a single golden loaf baked together that morning. Richard knelt without hesitation. "Eleanor Whitmore," he said, "you gave this castle more than food. You gave it compassion, honesty, and hope. I do not ask you to stand behind my title. I ask you to stand beside my life. Will you marry me?" Tears brightened Eleanor's eyes, yet laughter softened the moment. "I will," she answered, "if every child who enters this kitchen always leaves with warm bread." Richard smiled. "I promise." Their wedding became unlike any celebration the duchy had ever witnessed. Nobles shared long tables with servants, musicians welcomed stable boys to dance beside ladies, and every orphan found a place of honor instead of pity. Rather than receiving expensive gifts, Richard and Eleanor requested books, seeds, tools, and baking supplies for the children growing up within the estate. Before the feast ended, Eleanor announced the opening of a permanent school inside the castle where every servant's child could learn reading, mathematics, baking, gardening, bookkeeping, or any trade they wished to pursue. Opportunity, she declared, should never depend upon birth alone. Several months later the bakery buzzed with cheerful voices as young apprentices prepared the morning's bread. A nervous orphan carried the finest loaf to Richard, who broke the crust, smiled at its familiar warmth, and asked the question that had changed every life within the castle. "Who made this bread?" The child looked toward Eleanor. She placed a gentle hand upon the youngster's shoulder before answering with quiet pride. "We all did."